Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the gentleman I'm about to you. We're in southern Wyoming, almost over to the edge of Nebraska. We're in Pine Bluff, Wyoming. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Charles Vore. Charles, it's a pleasure being with you today, and share a little about your project, what your crew's doing here, and let us know what's going on, and feel free anytime through to invite the people by to see what you're doing. We'll tell them more about that just in the close. So just share with us. Thank you for having us.
Okay, well, thank you. I guess I'm slated here to tell you a little bit about the High Plains Archaeology Project. As you just heard, we're centered in Pine Bluff, Wyoming, although we do work in a lot of surrounding areas. Basically, this started out as a typical university research project. In fact, we're here from the University of Wyoming up in Laramie. It went on there to become a sort of a partnership with the city of Pine Bluffs, who helps us by providing facilities and so forth, and we're able to open the project up to the public. The High Plains Archaeology Project then, as you would see if you came down and looked at our little homemade museum here, actually researches sites for 50 or 75 miles in all directions. These little dots on this map, I don't know if you can see those, but each of those several dozen little dots is in fact an archaeological site that we're actively researching. Some are sites that we're testing, some are major excavation sites, some are just sites that we've done a little mapping and know the potential is there for research. With just what we know now, we can do research here for something approaching several decades, and we're finding out more each year. So basically it is a research project. As I'll be showing you a bit of today, however, to do research it takes a certain kind of facilities. For a long-term project like this, we really have to set up field labs and museums and dining halls and field camps and water screening areas. So if you came down and visited us here, we might be telling you a little bit about some of the facilities and try to get you out in some of those. The kinds of archaeological sites that we have down here are primarily of two basic types. One type are those that are prehistoric in nature. These are the sites of the Native American Indians that inhabited this area. The other type of sites are historic sites, as we refer to them. That's basically the archaeology of us. It's the people pushing out here in the frontier up to and including the homestead era and so forth. So as you come down here, you would be learning about stone circle sites, or teepee ring sites as they're called. These are stone circles that are placed around the base of a teepee lodge, and when the people, rather than using stakes, and when the people move, the rocks sort of tip off of the buffalo hide cover and just stay there in a kind of a circular shape. We have something approaching 800 to 1,000 of these stone circles within a couple miles of the city of Pine Bluffs, and there are thousands more going down to Colorado and off into Nebraska. So that's one type of site that we can really learn a lot from, as I'll show you over here at another display. We have rock shelters where people would live underneath of a rock, kind of an overhang. We have prehistoric defensive fortresses. We have stage stations, cavalry training bases, buffalo kills, prehistoric trails, a whole complex of sites then, with Pine Bluffs kind of being our base of operations so we can work out into those. The main aspect of this research, however, is the Pine Bluff site. The Pine Bluffs Archaeological Site is right on the edge of town, right out here on the west side of town, and it also is open to the public. What we have there is a series of stratified levels that go down about 10,000 years, as near as we can determine. By stratified, we mean just layered. The main Pine Bluff site has the most complete cultural sequence of any site that we're aware of in the region, and it's kind of the master key that we tie everything else into. So if you were to go out to the Pine Bluff site, you might be seeing scenes like this, where people are at work excavating down into these deep deposits, and a whole series of levels going on down about 20 feet in depth. The top levels at the Pine Bluff site are in fact the old city trash mittens, the old city dump as it were, but it's 1880s material, 1890s, and it's among the earliest kinds of historical resources in this area. European or American presence in this area didn't really begin until the 1840s, got kind of rolling with the railroad in the 1860s, and it was really well into the 1880s before ranching and homesteading was well established here. So you would be seeing levels like that out at the site, artifacts being recovered, and so forth. That's the Pine Bluff site. Over here we begin to orient people to the fact that along with research comes education. We really try to make this available to the public. We really try to tell them the story of the cultures in this area. We kind of celebrate the Native American cultures. We go on to talk about our own culture and how it developed and thrived out in this kind of dry, desertic, high plains area. In talking about education, we have basically 40 educational programs that we would put in motion here at any one time at the Pine Bluff site. Now, one of those programs is tourism, you might say, but that's just one program. Along with that would come things like workshops for science teachers, university field schools for our students to receive professional training. We have programs that involve extension classes that are taught in the evening so people can get college credit out in these areas. And we could list 40 different programs of that type. These are some of the syllabuses that we've put out from just some of the groups we've had through this year. I think we've had 15 groups here this year, ranging from antique car clubs to science teachers groups that come in for real intense workshops for several days. 3 days from now we'll be having a group through here that are science teachers from throughout the country, from everywhere, as I understand it, from Louisiana to Alaska, that is one that is supported by Chadron State College over here in Nebraska, and they'll be bringing in 30 science teachers, and we'll be working with them for 4 days to really increase their knowledge about science and how they can teach it in their classroom from kindergarten through 12th grade. So we do a lot of educational programs. If you're doing it properly with research, that's not an esoteric sort of thing like you're just trying to learn something that nobody else would be interested in. In fact, that's how you learn the history. That's how you develop these ideas. That's how you have something to tell the people. And if you're doing it properly, you do research first so you can tell that story. Then you bring the education in there. And behind that comes economic development. This board over here is talking a bit about that. As a result of our efforts in public education, we now have sales tax money from the citizens of Laramie County, Wyoming, to build a kind of museum building over the excavation site out there. So we're going to build a second museum building out there, and it's going to have excavation profiles that are stabilized and turned into museum displays. It'll have other museum displays similar to what you're seeing here. And then in the other half of the building, we'll have archaeologists at work for probably 5 or 10 years at least, developing further excavations. So the idea out there is that if you promote these educational aspects, you can have long-term, high-quality economic development. If you try to do the economic development first and foremost and get all involved in selling rubber tomahawks or the red chicken feathers, that's okay, it's just tourism, then what you find is that the quality gradually erodes. So first research, then education, then economic development. This is our 7th year here, and it's working. Mention again then that basically we're open all day, every day here in the museum in the summertime from June through August, and anybody coming this way is sure welcome to stop in and get kind of a tour such as you're seeing here, and then go on out to the site and watch the people work and get another guided tour out there. That's what we like to do. If there are people that have an interest in bringing in educational groups or more substantial tours or several days of workshops, then we work those kinds of arrangements out too. So that's kind of the High Plains project. In our little homemade museum, you see some of the different spears and replicas and actual Indian weaponry and things around the museum here for atmosphere, and that's kind of what's going on. Usually at this point we come over here and begin to talk in a little more detail about the actual findings in the area. The first thing is to talk about is the chronology. The spear points over here below the window, which actually are plastic casts of these same spear points, represent some of the finest examples of prehistoric flint knapping, working of chipstone, that have been found in the world. These implements down here are the ones that were used to hunt extinct big game like mammoths or extinct bison and so forth. As you go up through time, you find there are a series of changes in weaponry, really with more changes in function than in just like aesthetic appeal or style. They would go to a different kind of weapon, and they would balance it with different sizes of points and different kinds of hafting, using notches to tie it or lash the point onto the spear and so forth. Well, these changes are fairly distinct, and we know the dates on these particular points and can date sites by their presence. But looking at those distinct kinds of spear points through time in eastern Wyoming, this is about the sequence you would get. Another aspect of that is that these are, in fact, spear points. These are small spear points, although many people call these arrowheads. They're not really arrowheads. They're made for small spears. Only the smallest ones up here at the very top are actual arrow points. It's interesting that throughout North America, for example, those are often called bird points. I guess the idea is grown in people's minds that they're little tiny points, so they must be for little tiny animals. Therefore, you could only shoot birds with them. And I've had people come in here and just insist that you can't hurt a buffalo with a little point like that. That's a bird point, isn't it? And I say, well, no, we find them right in the midst of vast quantities of buffalo bone or deer bone. Those are arrow points. No, you can't hurt a buffalo with that. And I say, well, we have a replica right here, and I'm going to shoot you in the leg. Won't hurt a bit because you're a lot bigger than a bird. Then they begin to get the idea that it's an arrow, all right, and they don't let me shoot them as far as that goes. Okay, so that's the sequence, basically. I'm going to wander back over here now that I think about it. I guess told me I could be a bit freewheeling here. This is the kind of weapon that would be utilized with those small spear points. Let me just see if I can get this replica down off the wall here. Basically, this is called an atlatl. That's an Aztec word. Atlatl means a spear and spear thrower, and it was thrown with a throwing stick like this that has a kind of a hook in it, so that you butt the spear, which has a cup in it, into the shaft of the spear like that, the throwing stick that is, and then you throw it kind of like this. When you come over with that stick, you push it out with that stick, and that propels it with much greater velocity and distance than just a regular thrown spear or something like that. This, for example, is like having a longer arm, more leverage. You can throw it further like you had a longer arm. Also, this has spring to it, so it's kind of like half a bow. It has a kind of a bow-like spring that compresses and then propels the spear with even greater velocity. And some of the darts, the thin whippy darts, not so much like this one, but certainly we have various replicas and modern ones. A spear such as perhaps something like this might be something that would have a bit of flexibility and spring to it. So when it comes off of there, it's flexing and then springing out, adding to the impetus of that projectile you're throwing. This particular kind of weapon is something that you can basically, just about anybody can take a smaller dart perhaps than this, but a thin dart, and throw this half again as far as the Olympic record for javelin throw. Olympic record for javelin throw with those world-class athletes is going out there something like 90 meters. You get a simple little whippy stick and a whippy dart, you can throw it out there 120 meters, 150 meters. There's no comparison between a handheld spear and one thrown with a throwing stick. This was the main weapon for most of human prehistory. This is what the people call arrow points, or actually small spear points, were usually attached to. It had kind of a detachable foreshaft in many instances. This particular replica here is one that was an idea we have that it was tied with kind of a toggle-like effect and would come all undone and snag in the bushes, and this would be moving around in the animal, and that animal would not go very far. Kind of a not the best sort of thing for the animal, but that's how they made their living. In many cases, though, they just had a foreshaft, and they would just carry a bag of these rather than a quiver of arrows, and when you run up and pick your spear up where it's fallen off an animal, you just slap in another foreshaft, and you're right back in business. This was the main weapon for all of humanity for most of prehistory. People think it was the bow and arrow, but actually it was used by Australians into the modern times. It was used by Eskimos to throw harpoons. It was used by European people up to, say, 5,000 years ago in Europe. It was used up to about AD 500 in this area when they began to switch to the bow because of certain advantages it provides. A bow, you can be very accurate, and you can sort of use it in short-range ambush hunting much better than this. On the other hand, this is the sort of thing, you can take something like this and throw it on the run. You're flitting through the junipers after a deer, and you can throw it on the run. Try that with a bow sometime. It doesn't work very good. The fact of the matter is that this is quite a weapon. When you throw this thing, goes out there 100 yards, comes sailing down in a shower of darts, going 100 miles an hour, and if it hits anything, it knocks it flat. Bows got more velocity, in fact, and more accuracy, but this is the sort of thing that you can really do with it. With this weaponry right here, something very similar to this, the Aztecs simply decimated the Spanish conquistadors when they first attacked them in the Valley of Mexico in the 1500s. I mean, you'll hear about how the Spaniards, got in there, and these few Spaniards conquered this mighty nation. In fact, what happened was the Spaniards charged in there to attack them. The Aztecs showered them with big heavy darts tipped with volcanic glass or obsidian. They penetrated armor. They killed horses. They simply sent the Spanish reeling back in defeat until they learned through a bloody battles over a series of months to get about 4,000 Indian allies out in front of them eating darts until the Aztecs ran out of spears. That's the only way that they had any success in conquering them. The atlatl, something we like to talk about, something we like to show people. Get rid of this, I think, here. So, back where we were anyway, we're talking about these atlatl tips and so forth. About this point, people are interested in the prehistoric chronology seen here, but also they're very interested in the Indian tribes, the people that were in this area. Gosh, we had a couple in here the other day from Germany. They're very excited about things having to do with Native Americans over there, and they began to ask us what tribes were right in this area and so forth. So we bring them over to this little simple display here to answer that question. But it turns out not to be such a simple question, because all of the groups we know of as Plains Indians, all the historically known groups, about 30 groups in all, were not on the plains before AD 1500. There was a little ice age, that was called, a big upswing in moisture, a big upswing in bison populations. Bison on the plains probably went from 8 or 10 million animals up to 60 million in a few centuries, and most of these people moved out there to take advantage of those growing bison populations. So when you see, this is mostly just northwestern plains tribes, but when you see Plains Ojibwa or Crow or groups like that, they were not out there before about AD 1500. And when you go right down here to eastern Wyoming, this is Pine Bluffs under here, under all this business, you'll find there were, for example, an earlier wave of migrants, Kiowa Apache and Kiowa, the Comanche, and they were followed by the more well-known groups, perhaps the Cheyenne, Dakota or Lakota or Sioux, the Arapaho and the Shoshone pushing for position. So all of these people kind of jockeying for position on the plains, and that's the answer to the question of who was here, all of those groups and more that we know of. The Comanche came all the way down from Wyoming. They in fact are basically a southern Shoshone group. My friends up on Wind River Reservation, they come down here sometimes and they see this and they say, "Oh, did you know Comanche, they really speak that Shoshone language?" I said, "Yes, as an anthropologist I know that." "Did you know that's so close to our language that we can talk to them, we can understand each other?" They talk kind of like that when they're putting it on pretty thick, And I say, "Yes, we knew that, we knew that." They say, "But they're extremely hard to understand." I say, They say, "They speak with a noticeable southern accent." That's kind of the Indian joke that they have there. I've heard that about 20 times, but I always laugh because it's pretty funny. So the Kiowa were found all the way up into these areas and moved clear down to Texas and so forth. So that's the answer to the question of who was in this area. And the point I guess I would make is that all of this dynamics, all of this migration, all of this movement, all of this jucking for position on the Buffalo Plains is the top half an inch on this chart. So take that situation, all that action in a couple, 3 centuries, multiply it by 10,000 years, and you're beginning to see some of the possibilities for doing archaeological research in this area. Well, people often learning what tribes in this area are even more interested, and they begin to ask us, well, how do you know that? How do you pin that down? Where's the evidence for that? Basically, what we're able to relate to them is there are several kinds of evidence. One kind of evidence would be the archaeology. It's not so easy to do. You can follow these people archaeologically. They have certain kinds of diagnostic pottery that is an ethnic marker. That's Crow pottery, that's Shoshone pottery, when you find it. And not all tribes had that. Most people, I think, just think that we go out there and look at an arrow point and say, that's what it is. Okay, well, it's what we call the John Wayne theory of archaeology. It's kind of like you get the picture of an old John Wayne movie where it's, looks like Comanche out there. Well, it's not that simple at all, but we do have a little bit of archaeological evidence. What we also have are early accounts by explorers. However, as anthropologists have found, that's not nearly so simple. This is a chart of 3 main bands of the Cheyenne, And these are what they're called on early maps, some name that some other Indian tribe called them. And here's what they're called by the Vore brothers in 1743. Those were French names that really don't mean anything in Indian languages. Here's another set of maps where we finally find what the Cheyenne called themselves, and so on and so forth. So it's all mixed up with different names by different people. Some of the best evidence really is the traditions of the people themselves. Most of these plains tribes, for example, kept winter counts. They're called winter counts. And what they would do is take a big bison robe, and they would paint a symbol on there for each year of the tribe's history. Sometimes even carrying these for centuries, and as the hide got kind of old and worn out, they'd renew it. And they would paint these symbols around in a kind of a big spiral. And late at night you can envision the people sitting around in a warm fire in the winter in the teepee, and the old people telling the tribal history. And they would look at a kind of symbol there, and they'd remember that story. And then they'd remember other stories. Oh, that was the year that so-and-so happened. And they could tell the whole tribal story and even educate the young people about things. This is the Kiowa migration here, just some things we put up so we can talk about them like this. And here's a selection of some of these symbols, as you would see. Well, here's a symbol here that is the winter of 1858, and this is a man named Wolf lying down. Here's a little wolf lying down up here, if you can see that. That's how they remember his name. That line that you see here and in various other ones is a name line. That means this was the man's name or the woman's name. And then a little symbol that's the story of that year. This, in fact, is one where he's shown in a sprawled-out death pose, because the story goes that Wolf lying down was pursuing horses with the folks down near Mexico, stealing horses. And they told Wolf lying down, don't take the colts, they'll slow you down. They'll slow you down, and the Mexican soldiers will catch you. Well, he got a little greedy, and he wanted all the colts he could round up, and sure enough, they slowed him down, and they caught him and shot him through the ribs, and that's when Wolf lying down died on the big horse raid to Mexico. And what they'd be telling the young people is the tribal history, and also don't take the colts, leave them alone, you know. So we talk about Plains Indian history. We kind of celebrate Native American culture. They had wonderful artistry with all the beadworks. Over here we begin to show earlier forms of shell beads, and then we get into bear claws and eagle claws, eventually into glass trade beads. There are ways in which glass trade beads basically get smaller through time as they got better and better at making them, and we can sort of use those to date sites and so forth. This is a typical scene over here with a group of folks have come in with some things they found, I guess, and Mike's over here telling them more than they ever wanted to know about it. Meanwhile, Deborah's up here cataloging some of the collections from the upper levels at the Pine Bluff site. So it's kind of a working lab. It's a place where we like to get some of our work right out front. We'll show you some more areas in the back and invite people to come in and check out stuff. I think I'm going to be swinging through there in a minute, though, Mike, if I get you guys to move around there. We'll be there in just a second. Over here, for example, we're trying to develop our little hands-on things for the kids with shaft wrenches, where you would take, this is just a replica, but we'd show them how you could take this and straight narrow shafts, and fire drills where you would come in here on something like this and make fire, you know, with tinder. Different knives, little games. These are bone sort of dice or gaming pieces that we find in sites. These are just replicas, but there's a lot of games you can play with guessing which hand has the certain kind and so forth. This is one the kids really like. Here is a pump drill replica that Mike Peterson has made up for us. And all it is a thong attached to this stick and a little stone flywheel that's been shaped out, and it works like this. It's a pump drill. Used by people throughout the world, and the kids figure that out right away, and you can kind of see what they've been doing here in the last few weeks, where they've got the board all drilled to pieces here. We're going to have to get some new drill boards. By the time we get over here, we've begun to introduce to people in our tour here that archaeology is indeed something that you learn from. A lot of people think we're in it for the artifacts, that we're looking for goodies, that we're trying to get museum pieces. And in fact, we like those kinds of things, but really what we are after is the information. It's the knowledge. It's what we learn from it that's important. So when we talk about the Muddy Creek sites over here in central Wyoming, and we talk about these large stone circles or teepee rings, we begin to talk about how from these teepee rings you can learn about social organization and about family size and group size and how they were organized. We look at something like that and we see a map of a social organization, not just a bunch of old rocks out on the prairie, as it were. Similarly, when we move around over in here, we begin to talk about what we call faunal analysis. how you analyze zoological materials and what you can learn from them. We put up displays where we can tell people more about how you look at juvenile mandibles and tooth eruption and wear, and therefore you can age the animal within about a month. A bison that's 10,000 years old, say, and therefore you can say what season of the year that site was occupied. If you have a 6-month-old calf that was killed in September, say, then you know when that kill took place. So it's diet, it's nutrition, it's season of occupation, it's things like that that we learn from these little scrappy bits of bone and things like that. And that's really what it's all about, how you learn from things. Over in here is a series of displays that relate to what we call flint knapping, or the ancient art of making tools out of glassy stone. A lot of people don't have a good idea how you do this. Other people have a lot of erroneous ideas. There's one of the oldest stories around is that you somehow take and heat a rock red hot and then put drops of cold water on it. And then that is the kind of thing that makes pieces fly off, and that's how you shape it. Well, you can't control that. It shatters your stone. In fact, what you do is use a series of hammerstones and antler knappers like this, and you take large chunks of rock and you break pieces off in a controlled fashion and then shape them down with different kinds of antler tools. So they go out and mine the stuff, and they make a core or something like this, say, then you can take flakes off of that all the way around it and begin to make the pieces of stone that you need to do the very basic tool types. This is a specialized kind of a core from Mesoamerica where little thin blades have been taken off. When those blades come off, they look about like this. Each of those blades is sharper than a razor blade. Notice I didn't say pert near as sharp as, or kind of as sharp as a razor blade. These have a feathered out edge, several molecules thick, that's like basically feathered out glass, and it's sharper than a razor blade. And that's the kind of property that you can exploit to make a whole series of different kinds of tools. And then we show glassy stone from throughout North America and, gosh, France and Texas and Egypt and Australia, kinds of places where people work this kind of glassy stone. And again, finally, then what we do is, how do you make it? Yes, but what can you learn from it? What's going on at a site function? Where are they getting the material from? Trade patterns, migration patterns. That's what it's really all about. And lots of other things around the museum here. We're talking about flint knapping and chip stone and what you can learn from it. Down there are prehistoric implements. These are modern replicas. These were made by various flint knappers around the country, myself, in fact, and Mike Peterson, my field director here, where you would find that we shape the stone ourselves so that we can begin to learn if our ideas are good about how they did it, if we got some feasible ideas. And so you make big spear points like this, and knives and tools. And we like to show people that and show them how it's done. We have a lot of kids get real excited about flint knapping. It's part of what we do around here. But again, along with that is evaluating our ideas about how you learn from this, about trade patterns and migration patterns and so forth. So modern stuff, old stuff, lots of this and that at the High Plains Archaeology Museum. This side of the room in the museum is really what we call historical archaeology, as I mentioned before. It's the archaeology of Pine Bluffs. And basically, Pine Bluffs was a small town that was sort of prominent in Wyoming history. In the 1880s, there were more cattle shipped from the railroad right here than any other place in North America. It was kind of the end point of some of the cattle drives when they weren't going clear to Montana for the gold fields, and they were just bringing the cattle up here from Texas. In fact, the Texas Trail, as it's called, went through Pine Bluffs on its way to Montana, and they shipped a lot of cattle from here. But it's a small town. A lot of people didn't write much down about it. There's almost no real history as far as written material goes about early day Pine Bluffs. But what we find is by excavating the historical materials, we can learn a lot about daily life in Pine Bluffs. So you would see things that, gosh, some people think it's trash, and we think it's treasure, you know. They wonder, well, we know they were using knives and forks. What do we care about that? But we say, oh, well, how about this place where in 1905 they cleaned out the basement of the drugstore, and we were able to excavate a little trash midden, and we got an 1894 quarter and a 1904 nickel and those store tokens and, you know, different things, watch fobs, military buttons, different kinds of things. We learn a lot about children's play, different kinds of toys and so forth. And then there's references you can look up. These little ceramic dolls are sometimes referred to as frozen Charlottes. And we wondered why that was, and finally tracked down that there was a ballad by William Lorenzo Carter in the 1840s, I think, back in New England, about a young lass who was going to the New Year's ball, and she was too vain to put on a heavy cloak and crunch down her crinoline and lace, so she went in an open sleigh with just a coat, and the song goes on about, "Are you all right, Charlotte?" "Yes, yes," she cried, her lips a-trembling. You know, they were kind of flowery in those days. And sure enough, by the time they reached the ball, she had frozen. So anyway, interesting tidbits. And over here are just, gosh, what could be more trashy than stuff like this, old broken crockery. But many of these have on the bottom maker's marks, they're called. And those maker's marks are things we can look up in these references. This is in fact a key reference that is from the journal Historical Archaeology. And in there it gives you the date and place of manufacture, so we can begin to date sites. We can learn about economic systems on the frontier, commodity flows it's called. So even broken crockery, things like these old dishes, this is something we learn something from. Another good example is over here, a display we're putting together on bottles. Broken or even broken, not even just complete bottles, are something we can learn to read like a book. We look at the mold seams, and we talk about dating, and we talk about nutrition and diet and what people were doing for patent medicine. So this whole display over here is just how you learn from bottles, what you can do with dating and different kinds of things like that. This specific site's kind of interesting. This is Camp O.O. Howard. Camp Howard was a military camp of instruction in 1885. It's not well known, and in fact the location of it basically had been lost. But in 1885, it's kind of the tail end of the Indian Wars, and they didn't want to lose their ability to instruct troops in convoying in enemy territory, their ability to bivouac and put up fortifications on short notice. So they brought troops in from Fort McPherson in Nebraska and Fort Robinson in Nebraska, and troops from Fort Laramie, I think, over here in eastern Wyoming, and Fort D.A. Russell, now F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne. And they brought them all down here, about 500 of them, under the command of Dangerfield Parker. There's Major Parker in here. And in any case, they had them for several weeks go through a whole series of exercises. It was known that this was down here just outside of Pine Bluffs, but that's all that there was to it. We began to look around and believe that we have discovered some of the fortifications and some of the camping areas from Camp Howard. We're not sure of that. We have military pattern shovels, and we have a cartridge, and we have some other implements that we think are tying us into Camp Howard. We don't know that, so at this point it's still officially designated as the Hopefully Howard site. Digging out here at Hopefully Howard, we're finding a lot of stuff that's on display here and in the back. This 4570 is what the troops would have been carrying. This is an old gun, but not certainly one that we found, but just for museum purposes. And this saber is what the officers would have been carrying. So these guys in these pictures are carrying a gun just like this. This is exactly the type they would have had. And the officers in this picture have these sabers draped all over it. It would have looked like that. One of the folks that's not with us this year, but is a military expert, historian, James Harrell from Cheyenne, by researching the archives at D.A. Russell, stumbled on to Dangerfield Parker's journal, and he got Xeroxes of that and then transcribed them with typewriting, and then he discovered this one here that said, "This afternoon the battalion will be formed for the purpose of having a photograph taken. First call at 3:50, etc." And he said if the Army took a photograph, then it's going to be somewhere. And then he finally found the photographs at the Fort Laramie archives. And so now here's the groups that gathered at 3:50 on September, September 16th, 1885 for the picture, and when they went on parades or put up tents and fortifications, we have the pictures of all that. So that's kind of interesting, a bit of local history. This is one display that we like to emphasize a bit here because, number one, this is one of the most spectacular archaeological sites in the world. This is the Vore Buffalo Jump. And number two, this is sort of my other project. We're attempting to develop another research center, an educational center up in northeastern Wyoming based on this site, where some of the things we're doing here at Pine Bluffs are kind of serving as the model. The Vore Buffalo Jump was a classic Plains Indian buffalo jump. Many people, I think, have heard how they would gather bison carefully together and stampede them over a cliff. And indeed they did. Of course, the artist's rendition, usually like this fine Dave Pauly painting here, usually has the Indians gazing majestically over the horizon while the buffalo gaily leap to their death. It wasn't quite like that. It was a dangerous, hot, nasty, dirty business in which you had these huge numbers of large, dangerous animals, and you had to induce them to go into a stampede where the ones in back of several hundred animals would force the front ones over the cliff. These front ones would basically put the brakes on. They would try to stop. They're very agile sort of animals, indeed. But the back ones would crowd them over the cliff, sometimes then following in the confusion and dust themselves. As a result of this, at the Vore Buffalo Jump, they were using a large round sinkhole with kind of cliff-like edges to stampede buffalo down into this, where they would be crippled, killed, and so forth. The survivors would be filled with arrows, and then the Indian folks were able to put up ton after ton of prepared meat, dried meat, pemmican, and so forth. A buffalo jump like this, with several hundred animals being killed and processed, meant an easy winter where you went hunting when you wanted to and sat around playing with your children and telling stories. A failure of a jump like this could be a hard winter hunting all winter to keep your family alive, and we have accounts of Cheyenne men who would return with frozen hands and feet from being caught in blizzards. So this was really a classic Plains Indian site, and at the Vore site, between about AD 1500 and AD 1800, only 300 years, the ancestors of at least 5 Plains Indian tribes ran as many as 20,000 animals over the edge of this cliff and butchered them down, rendering them completely down, and in many cases taken 3/4 of the bones away to be processed further for bone grease, marrow, and so forth. So what you have here are a series of levels going down into the site, going down to about 20 feet below ground. You're seeing some of the thicker levels here, but in fact there are thin levels above, and as I say, about 20 levels. Each one of those levels is 100 feet across and is just a complete midden of butchered bison bones. Sprinkled liberally, I guess, with arrow points of these types. It's the history of the Plains Indian groups, some of which moved on through Pine Bluffs later, and it's a very spectacular, exciting site. Coincidentally, the Vore site itself is located right next to Interstate 90. Like the Pine Bluffs site is next to Interstate 80, this one is between the interstate and the old highway on the other side. It's right between two highways with wonderful access to it, an exit ramp a couple of miles in either directions. And so I've started a campaign there with a nonprofit foundation, the Vore Buffalo Jump Foundation, located up in Sundance, Wyoming, to develop a major research center there. The Vore site's getting a lot of publicity. It's been on posters and in Time Life books and on the television because it's such a site that captures the imagination. And what we're going to try to do there is develop a large dome. That's the only way to stabilize the bone deposits and make them open for viewing, a building perhaps like you see on the board here or this artist rendition, and develop a major research and educational center right next to the interstate, and people would be able to walk right out into museum displays that would look like this. So it's something that's a major multi-million-dollar development campaign, but should it work, it'll really be something for the people of America to see. Well, now we've moved back to one of our laboratory areas behind the High Plains Museum. And basically what you're seeing here is a crew of students who actually have worked their way into becoming professional archaeologists. This is how many of our students put themselves through school, is by excavating and working in our labs in the summertime. What you're seeing here is what we call matrix processing, which is a fancy word for picking through the deposits from water screening, to look for little tiny bits of flakes and bones and gastropods or snails that can tell you about past climates. And what this means is that you can recover a lot of bits and pieces that are very informative. We get thousands of these things and accordingly can learn in some cases more than you can from just a few nice artifacts. So what you're seeing here is where Amber and the folks are picking through these sediments that have been washed through screening devices, and they're picking out little bits of chip stone and so forth, as I'm describing. So we have students who spend a lot of time going through bags, picking out bones, little sharpening flakes. We can tell what kind of tool those came from, and they're actually more informative than the tool itself, because we have a lot of these, as I say. And as you can see, it's a fairly tedious sort of process. And that's what these guys are doing, analysis of archaeological materials. Oh, in the background is our ethnobotany display. We like to talk about how you live off the land, I guess, and in some instances kind of trying to promote an Indian viewpoint, a conservation kind of viewpoint, because they were able to live off the land without destroying it, you might say, and certainly whereas we support larger populations now, the idea that there is more to the environment than you might realize is a good thing to come up with. So we have displays on edible plants, and I might add, eat them. We have workshops here where we go out and gather edible wild plants, and then have kids and so forth try them out. There's a lot of fun. Wild plums. We get people into weaving mats and doing cordage and so forth. So edible plants, little bits of stone, bones, that's all part of what we do. Just some back storage areas, but again, the idea is we like to bring people back here and show them this, have them sit down and try it, have them look what's going on, have them ask questions. With the backdrop of an old melodrama curtain, here are butchered bison bone, bag after bag of butchered bone from the Donovan site down near Sterling, Colorado, flakes, different kinds of artifacts, dirt, fire pit samples, geological samples. You have to have facilities like this, processing and so forth. And over here, Mike's demonstrating flint knapping to a family group. It's kind of interesting. It's some of the things we do. Okay, I've had my say. I feel better now.
Mike, you want to tell us what you're doing?
I'm shipping a little late prehistoric arrowhead out of some obsidian, some natural volcanic glass, using a white-tailed deer antler here, and about ready to notch it. Need to do a little grinding on the edge to shape a little more.
Mike's one of the foremost flint knappers in the world. Can basically do most things that they did prehistorically. And just likes to flint knap at the drop of a hat.
Seems that he has some interested students there.
Yes. Well, I got a call for doing a little flint napping with some folks from up Banner County, Nebraska there. Now I got the roughed out shape, kind of a triangular shape. I want to go to a deer antler times a little smaller diameter there. So let's see if we can find it real quick. Need to sharpen it down.
Yeah, I guess this flint knapping, this replication is something where, as I said before, we really evaluate our ideas about what works, what doesn't work, get a real good feel. Plus, as you see, it's educational. People like to watch it, and we learn about prehistoric technology. And I guess I'd have to say it's kind of therapeutic. You take these big rocks and break them up into small rocks, and then you feel better about it. But I guess having that demonstration well underway, we're going to move on out to the Pine Bluffs Archaeological site, and we're not up and running with a full crew there today, but we can show you a little bit of what's going on out there. We're walking by currant bushes, and this prickly poppy, it's a medicinal plant. That's sunflowers, that's wheatgrass. Different kind of grass. Pea vetch that you can do, that skunk brush sumac.
This holds up. That's good stuff.
Well, okay, I'll show you a better edible plant wrap over here by the site than if you think edible other kinds of berries in here, but
They make good.
Yeah,
That's what I think it is. It sure makes good.
yeah,
pies.
you bet, jam and stuff. It'll turn kind of purplish or blackish. It's a black currant.
No, that's not what we call them. What is it we call them?
But I guess we'll wander up to the site here and see what we can figure out, 'cause we sure got pounded last night. Well, we're out here standing on one of the excavation areas at the Pine Bluff site. What you're looking at are some wide trenches that we're digging through the old historic trash deposits. Basically, we're dealing with the history of frontier Pine Bluffs, in this case the homestead frontier, about 1900 and going on back to 1880. We're salvaging these trenches so that we can put in the foundations, the footings, for this museum building that's, you saw back of the museum, that's going to go over this excavation area, and then we'll be able to make museum displays out of the profiles and have archaeologists at work kind of as an educational workshop. We're going to have a situation here where you're going to be able to come in here and look right over the shoulder of archaeologists at work and ask them questions and so forth. This excavation area is just part of a site complex that covers 250,000 square meters. In other words, we're in one of the areas where it's a little more deposit, it's a little deeper stratified set of levels. But actually, the Pine Bluff site goes out all around you here. It's up on top where you have stone circle sites and stratified camp areas. There are burial grounds, prehistoric Native American burial grounds that we're protecting. Not something we actively research. Basically, the days are gone when our graves are somehow sacred, and yet Indian graves are fair game for anybody that wants to dig them or loot them or do science. We don't do that anymore, but we certainly have stumbled onto a few and we're protecting them. Military overlooks when they were protecting the railroad. There's 250,000 square meters of site here, and we're just in one little area of it. So, thought we'd show you a bit. That's kind of the view that you'll have out of the big windows in our museum building when it goes up. Needless to say, right behind us is Interstate 80. There's about, something I guess on the order of 7 million people a year that go right by this particular site. So at any given time, it's nothing unusual to hear all the trucks and things rumbling by here on Interstate 80. That little interchange area right out in there is what we call the Frontier Crossroads. Standing right here, you're looking at a place where prehistoric Indian trails went across up and down these bluffs and out into Lodgepole Creek Valley. Those prehistoric trails were quickly followed by historic Indian trails. The Cheyenne moved right through there and record that in their traditions. And then we had early military explorations, the Lieutenant Bryan expedition and so forth, camped right out in there. Then the Overland Trail, stage line that went through there, the Lodgepole Immigrant Trail, the first transcontinental railroad. That's the first transcontinental highway, US 30. That's the first transcontinental interstate, I-80. Heck, last year we got the first transcontinental telephone fiber optic cable. It all goes right through there. It's been a busy crossroads for about 10,000 years, and that's why we refer to it as the Frontier Crossroads. Yeah, kind of an interesting tidbit of history, I guess. Kind of a high-tech version of an atlatl, or thin, small spear, and basically the wind's against us here, so I won't be able to throw them too far. And let's see, the sun's in my eyes, what else can I use for an excuse? But just to give you an idea that they do work, I'll just flip them across the draw down in there and not try to throw them real far. We'll throw three of them out there and just show you what happens if you just give them a little flip like this. And over in that grassy flat. Okay, let's try another one. Let's throw this one a little further here. Just give her a little throwing motion. Yeah, right over near the trees. Wasn't a bad throw. Now, if we don't lose it in the trees, I'm going to try to beat that. Ready? Last couple throws were right out there, probably just over the Olympic record for javelin throw, if we were to pace it off. So that's the idea on these things. Okay, go out this way. We're over in the third excavation area at the Pine Bluff site. What we've got here is a little concentration of activity due to this feature right here. Now, when the ground surface was about 3 or 4 foot lower down in here, you could see how you had a little overhang. You could walk right back in here, and it provided shelter for the rain or wind or snow, and consequently there's a whole set of fire pits and activity around those. Basically a big fan of the kind of debris, stone flakes, bones that you saw down in the lab there being picked through are very, very intense right in here, very thick. There are levels down in here where we map a 1 meter unit and dig 5 centimeters of matrix. We're mapping and pulling 1,000 items. It's items that only an archaeologist could love, I guess. But you get some arrow points here, bits of broken bone there, some ceramics or pottery sherds there, different stone tools, and that's kind of noisy here, isn't it? I told you about I-80 over there, I guess. But that means as you pull down through a 1 square meter unit here, you're mapping 1,000 things, 2,000 things, 3,000 things, 4,000 things, 5,000 things maybe, just to get down to the bottom of about that much sediment. So that's 5,000 artifacts, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, 30,000, 35,000, 40,000, 50,000. You get the idea. This thing has a big fan with probably 250,000 little bits of butchered bone and sharpening flakes right out here in front of this rock shelter. The reason that there's so much activity here at the Pine Bluff site, in this place and in the other areas, is because what we have here is basically a little foothills outlier. All of these plants are what you normally would only find at the foothills of the Laramie Mountains, about 100 miles that way. But here we have all of these extra edible plants and deer and extra game and firewood and shelter right in here out in the old grasslands. Now when you put the riparian zones of Lodgepole Creek out there, kind of the zone that's along Indian River with other edible plants, and the foothill zone right in here, and the grasslands for bison hunting, you've got the best place to be if you're trying to earn a living off the land. There is in fact 50 edible plants within a few hundred yards of where we're sitting, 50 species of plants. If you go through here, you find over here we've got lemonberry or skunk breast sumac. Back in here are currants, yellow currants and black currants, good edible berries. And that's chokecherry back up there. Here's some of this lemonberry or skunk breast sumac. Back in here is Solomon seal. It gets a little berry on it. There are several edible species of grass. Prickly pear, which you can eat the flowers and eat the fruit underneath the flowers. Cook the spines off, burn the spines off and eat that. Yucca bulbs up there. Different kinds of edible plants everywhere you look. And then we could show you more. So we like to get people out here and show them these plants and have them eat them and so forth. That's really why all this activity is here. Down in here is one of our excavation areas where, in fact, you're not seeing the total depth of it. There are holes there covered up with shoring and plywood that go down to 20 feet below surface. And that's the thing we were talking about at the museum, that there are some 15 cultural levels stratified down in there, from things that were in the late Pleistocene or end of the Ice Age, right on up to the historic trash mitten. When you go down through this sequence, then you should be looking at where they cleaned up the drugstore in 1905, and right below that are trade beads and steel points from the Plains Indian tribes, the Arapaho and Cheyenne and so forth that we talked about. Below that is the Upper Republican culture, about AD 1300. It's called that because they moved out here from the Upper Republican River. That's the upper reaches of the Republican River, as opposed to Upper Republicans and Lower Democrats or something, I guess. And then it goes on down into levels that we call Plains Woodland, and then Early Plains Woodland, and then Late Archaic and Middle Archaic and Paleo-Indian. There's 15 cultural levels buried down here in this unusually deep soil deposit. The real sequence of history in this area is sealed into this site. Not the most dramatically rich site by most standards, but something we can learn a lot from. Well, we've moved down here into one of the excavation areas, the main excavation area, where, as I mentioned, we actually go down about another 6 feet below this floor. So imagine me standing down here with just my hat showing, and then all of that dirt up above. And this is unfortunately kind of all shored up now. It looks more like a condominium blew up than an archaeological site or something, I guess. But we're holding the profiles that we developed, and here's then where we're going to strip all this and chemically and mechanically stabilize these and have these profiles stepping down to 20 feet below ground, and then this is where we're going to put a museum building over it. Again, those levels that you're seeing up there, you can only just get a hint of them here in the corner, but there's the old city trash middens on top, and then Plains Indian trade beads and steel points below that, and then right on down to a whole series of cultural levels going clear on down to about that black plastic where it'll be about 10,000 years old. Come in here and begin to see that in these buried levels we have a little sharpening flake there.
Oh, yeah.
And a little artifact right there, and you can begin to see the charcoal specks throughout.
Yeah.
This is fire-cracked rock or burned rock. Here's another little sharpening flake here. This is buffalo bone washing out here. Buffalo bone over here. Nothing there. More buffalo bone from another level up there. So you just get the idea that there's
Wow, it's loaded.
stuff sprinkled all the way down through here. Now, there's more buffalo bone there. There's a fire-cracked rock probably near a fire pit. Now that level is something approaching 500 years older than that level because it's buried more deeply. Charcoal flecks all the way through here. So the stuff's here.
Sure is.
Because of this intense rain, we'll come out here later today and tomorrow and just crawl over this bank, making sure there's not something like a real nice diagnostic artifact or arrow point sticking out, you know, because it'll wash it out. But that's kind of what we're doing. Just
Doctor, we appreciate so much.
well, thank you, sir.
You're showing us through the digs, the work, the museum. And could you tell us how is it best that someone would contact you or any organization that wanted to come? Is it all right if we give them your mailing address, and are they welcome?
Surely. As we say, from June through August, we're open at the museum all day, every day. The site, however, about every other weekend is closed down. You are welcome to come and look at it, but the crew are not working here, so you might want to check our schedule and see when the best time to come here. Call High Plains Archaeology in Pine Bluffs at 245, I should say the area code for Wyoming at 307-245-9372. Write us at Box 32, Pine Bluffs, Wyoming. The zip is 82082. Or just get a hold of me during the winter up at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. And we'd be happy to arrange a group tour. Otherwise, just come on by.
Well, thanks again very much for having us by.